We're back. In the previous video, we talked about the basic building blocks of language and how we can combine phonemes into more meaningful units called morphemes, which we then combine grammatically into sentences using semantics and syntactical rules. We also talked about parts of the brain responsible for language, which should have been a review from our bio unit. In this video, we're going to be talking about things related to language acquisition. So how do we learn language? How do other animals learn language? And yeah, that's pretty much it. There's a lot here though, so we're just going to dive right in. Okay. So we know that other animals, non-human animals, can understand language, right? And anytime you ask your dog to sit or to stay, right, it understands what you're asking it to do. Um, and we also know that animals can be taught to use symbols to, get things that they want. So, on the left here we have a bonobo who's been taught, different symbols to get what they want, and a great African gray parrot, has also been able to basically spell out words what they want using magnetic letters. There's even examples of dogs being trained on a speech board, so that they press a certain button and it says, I want a treat, or I need to go outside, or you know, cuddles or something, right? Like they actually can learn what the buttons are. But is that the same thing as language? Is that the same thing as understanding and creating language? Um, Even animals that can understand sign language, that have the dexterity to produce sign language, um, they usually have very limited phonemes that they can use. And even if it's something like a parrot that can, basically mimic an English language or any human language, they have a really hard time understanding grammar and following grammar rules. Things like the order of words that are used really means nothing. So there's no concept of, subject verb agreement. Does the object of the verb come after the verb? What about, adjectives and stuff we've talked about in previous videos? For non-human species, that's pretty much non-existent. It seems like those are things that only humans are able to do. From an instinctual level, right? We almost don't even need to learn those things. Okay, so so jury's out. But how do we do language acquisition with animals? So, there have been really famous examples of researchers teaching higher primates sign language, right? Understanding that their vocal cords and vocal apparatus are not evolved enough, I guess, or evolved in a way. I don't want to say evolved enough. Evolved in a way to produce something that would mimic or be similar to human speech and human spoken language. But sign language, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, are dexterous enough to produce sign language. So the question is, when you do that, are they actually speaking a language? And so there's an example here of this chimpanzee here learned 160 words in sign language, roughly, and was able to combine them into new thoughts. So things that they wanted, they could sign, or if they were missing something, they could sign that. But again, lacking the understanding of grammar rules. So while it seems like that chimps in particular have kind of the neurological underpinnings of language, right? That there seems to be something there. They're just not as complex enough yet to create their own language, create their own spoken language. Um, in fact, chimps, even the brightest chimps don't come anywhere close to a human toddler in terms of language acquisition. Toddlers just are like sponges for language. They just pick up everything and respond in kind. It seems innate. In fact, some argue that it is innate. Whereas with animals, it is very much like a training process. So if you've ever trained, a dog or something, right, it can take a long time to finally get it right. Um, Language acquisition in non-human animals is like that. It's very much based off of rewards and punishments and things that have worked in the past. So this is a long way of saying there seems to be an evolutionary basis for human language development. But we also know that there's a major nature-nurture interaction here with language. So again, just like everything else, it's not one or the other, it's both. We know that there has to be a capacity for language that we are born with because every human society has a language. And that follows grammar rules and other things. But we also know that someone born to an English speaking family does not suddenly start speaking Swahili or Mandarin or something, right? They're going to grow up speaking English. So there is a nurture interaction here as well. It's kind of weird to think about, but babies are born with the ability to speak every human language. Otherwise, languages wouldn't exist, right? So, there's no such thing as a baby that can't speak, Arabic or something, right? If they're able to produce the phonemes, then it matters, right? All the phonemes, even if we have a hard time saying them ourselves, right? At some point, we would have been able to do so. Something like it gets my family. We make fun of people with this. I guess it's mean to say, but rolling your R's, right? The sound, which you use in Spanish a lot, right? Some people can't do it, but if they grew up speaking Spanish, then they could. Then everybody can roll their R's, because that's necessary for the language. So there's this nurture interaction, right? That if it's not used, right, that sound doesn't get used a lot in English, it disappears, and those people have a harder time making that sound. Same thing with some of the languages in South Africa that are like Xhosa, which is a language that has clicks. They're really hard to make if you're not a native speaker. So there's this kind of if you learn the language Xhosa, which the word itself has a click in it, there's rules about how you pronounce words without the click, so you can communicate effectively. This gets to something called a sensitive period, which we'll talk about more in development. But basically, that there are windows where we are better able to learn things, specifically languages, and the phonemes associated with that. That there are windows that if we miss that window in our development, we lose that ability. Right? It's kind of like just this like window in time that allows you to do something, and if you miss it, then it's gone. So every baby can speak. Any newborn can speak any language that humans have developed, but also that you lose the ability to produce certain phonemes or even to hear. Right, so it's not even just producing the phonemes; it's hearing differences among phonemes. Again, there are some languages that are tonal, right? That depending on the pitch that a word is said, it could mean different things. Mandarin is an example of that. So you can imagine someone who might have a hard time hearing pitch that might not be able to understand what people are saying because, right, the tone is a morpheme, right? It's carrying meaning. So again, something I said in a previous video, the number of phonemes in a language is largest near the west coast of Africa and then decreases as you get farther away. So that's pretty remarkable, right? The human vocal apparatus, our vocal cords and all the biological components of that, our tongue, our ability to control our breath, can allow us to produce over 500 different phonemes. Although there are very few languages that come anywhere close to that number of phonemes. And infants are able to distinguish those sounds. In fact, right, they just have the ability to differentiate different phonemes within the first couple years of life, and basically say, "Oh, this is not something that we use in our language," and then they stop making those sounds, and then those sounds become more difficult to create again due to those sensitive periods. What's happening in the brain is that there is pruning, right? That there are neural connections that are being lost because they're not being used. Remember, neurons that fire together wire together. But the adverse is true, that if neurons don't communicate often, then they lose the ability to do so over time. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much everything else here is pretty much a repeat of other things. So let's talk about milestones in language development. So, if you've ever been around an infant, maybe not necessarily a newborn, newborns are pretty silent except for the crying. But if you're ever around a newborn, you know that they babble a lot, that they just kind of make different sounds. Some are all involving phonemes, right? There's cooing, there's babbles, there's, crying even, right? Some parents know like what a cry, oh, this cry means he's hungry, or this cry means that she has to go to the bathroom or that she went to the bathroom or something. Um, right? That parents can pick up on that because they sound differently, but to everyone else, they just kind of sound like the baby's crying. But what's really interesting is that by around 6 months of age, babies are almost exclusively babbling in the language that they speak. It's weird to think that babbling is related to language, but it is. Um, if there are certain languages that don't have certain phonemes, then the baby doesn't really produce those babbles. A lot of Asian languages have hard times with R's and L's because those phonemes don't exist in Japanese or Korean or Mandarin. So there's a hard time as much as that is a more easily understandable phoneme for us, right? It's hard for people to hear that if they don't grow up with it. And babies don't babble with L's or R's in around 6 months in Japan or Beijing or something like that, because that's not a phoneme that is native to those languages. And likewise, right? English-speaking families don't have babies that babble in Mandarin because that's not what they're hearing. By the time infants around a year old, they're usually said their first word, which is usually the name for a parent, dada, mama, something like that. And that's pretty similar across cultures. Also, the word for mother and father is usually a very easy word to say. Mother and father aren't the easiest, but mama, dada, those are pretty easy to say, right? It's a repeating consonant verb pair that is pretty easy to do. So it makes sense that those would be the first words that babies would say. And while babies typically don't have the ability to say a lot of words, research shows that they understand a lot more. So basically, their cognitive component here is much farther along than their physical ability to actually produce the sounds that they need to communicate. So, all these things are pretty interesting in terms of language development. Now, another thing we see here is something that we call the vocabulary spurt. So, really, in the second year of life, right after they turn one, babies start seeing this vast increase in their vocabulary and the words that they know, and it looks like that. It's exponential growth here, which is important and tends to show that there is a biological component here, that there is something about that second year of your life, 18 months and so, where you're just a sponge for words and you're just learning all of these new words. By age 6, most children have acquired about 10,000 words, and by age 10, it's about 40,000. So, right, the understanding of vocabulary is important here. And when we look at very young children, it seems again that we are hardwired to distinguish, words in our vocabulary, but also we seem to be hardwired to distinguish animals and other moving objects from non-living objects. That there seems to be some brain parts of the brain that are specifically focused to things that move. And an interesting thing is children who learn American Sign Language, right? So they're either born deaf or have deaf parents, or even just parents who sign, also learn the vocabulary, which is signed instead of spoken, on a similar schedule as speaking children. and that the sign language appears to rely on the same cortical areas, right, in our brain as our spoken language does. Um, so there really is, from the brain's perspective, almost no difference between a signed language and a spoken language. In fact, when we look at milestones, you know, babies who are learning sign babble in sign. Just like a 6 month old will, ba ba da ba whatever. Babies who are learning sign as their first language will babble in sign. Um, but also, just like vocabulary spurts and other things, these sensitive windows are really important. It's really important for new parents to have their newborns tested for hearing, because being deprived of language for even just a short amount of time is very detrimental to the child. It can stunt their growth, cognitive growth. It can kind of slow them down a little bit. Um, Children are resilient, so it's not like it's going to necessarily be the worst thing. But in terms of brain development, it is so important for our developing brain to have access to language. Um, so signing, if you are a parent of a deaf child, it's important, if you don't already know sign language, to learn sign language as quickly as possible, so that the child can develop in a language rich environment. And actually, children tend to be able to sign better than they can speak. That the muscles that control hand movements are easier to control than speaking. So I had a friend in college who, when she was learning to speak, her parents would sign everything that they were saying. They weren't hard of hearing; they just knew sign language and basically taught her sign language. And before she could even say words, she could sign them. And the cool thing was whenever she would be, I remember distinctly a conversation I was having with her, and she was having a hard time coming up with a word. Like, you just like, oh, what's that called? And she actually signed it in front of her, because she could remember the sign easier than she could remember the word in English. And then she basically translated it back into English. And then she's like, oh yeah, this or whatever. I don't remember what the word was. But right, because almost like sign was her first language. That's kind of how she operated. So it was kind of again, talks about the importance of sign and sign languages. Right, from brain's perspective, it's exactly the same thing as a spoken language, which is really interesting. Okay, grammar. Just like sensitive periods with producing phonemes, we have sensitive periods with learning grammar. By around age 12, the sensitive period for learning grammar ends. So if you have not learned the rules of a language by 12, it becomes much more difficult for you to do that. So even though, right, we're able to learn languages very easily, especially as a child, um, it becomes much harder as we get older. Now, I know what some of you are saying, like, well, then why do we have to take a language in high school, right? Why do I have to learn French or Spanish or something? Um, Sensitive periods for grammar really means any grammar. So once you learn grammatical concepts, then you're able to apply them to other languages that you may learn later in life. Um, Whereas if you grow up without grammar, maybe you're a deaf child and you were never taught sign language, and it's just kind of you're having a hard time understanding things, right? Then by the age of 12, you really are at a major loss of ever learning grammar. Um, but we do know that children in bilingual households, right? So if it's either a society that's multilingual or a situation where one parent speaks a language and another parent speaks another, um, the child usually creates what are called Creole languages, which is this kind of weird mix of languages between two or more that have their own grammar structure, um, which then can sometimes, in the case of what we call Creole, right, this French indigenous African hybrid, um, right, can that happen in the Caribbean islands, like that can become a dominant language in and of itself. But when we're talking about bilingual households, right, that's a lot of times you'll hear families that just kind of slide back and forth between them, between languages, right? Like half the sentence will start in Spanish and then end in English, and then they'll start again in Spanish, and right, which can seem very confusing for non-native speakers because we're constantly, like code switching. We're constantly, when I speak Spanish, I kind of need to be in a mindset to speak Spanish to at least be able to understand it. Um, anyone who's been in the Dominican knows that, at least I think, that my Spanish gets better the longer we're there, because the more you're around it, the easier it comes to you. But for native speakers, like especially native bilingual speakers, it's just as easy to go back and forth between them than to stay in one or the other. So again, let's look at some milestones here. And I know this video is getting a little long, but we're almost done, and it doesn't make sense to stop. So we'll just kind of keep trucking along here. So there's a little table for you if you need it. So let's talk about language acquisition from a couple of different perspectives. So first up, we have what are called behaviorist theories, which, if you remember from the behavioral unit, right, or behavioral psychology from the beginning of the year, this almost all has to do with rewards and punishments. That basically children acquire language through conditioning, that they are rewarded when something good happens, when they say the word correctly, even if that reward is just that person understood you, that kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We'll talk about nativist language acquisition, which is what Chomsky favors. And then we'll kind of talk about the blend of the two. So first up, Skinner believed that language development was almost all based off of learning principles. So when the baby is babbling and just kind of going like goo goo gaga mama da, right? When it says mama, if the mom's around, she might freak out, right? And, oh my gosh, baby just said mama, and like give it a lot of attention and hugs and first word and make a big deal. So then the baby learns, oh, well, when I go mama, this person freaks out and gives me attention. So now every time I say mama, she's going to come. When I say dada, he's going to come over here and say that, right? And that's how Skinner said language development worked, that it was just totally based off of rewards and punishments, imitating others. And, there seems to be a lot of anecdotal evidence to support that. On the opposite side, you have someone like Noam Chomsky, who, oddly enough, is from Philly. He's a linguistics professor at MIT. He basically argues that because of that vocabulary spurt that we talked about before, where it's just like it shoots up, but you can't do that just through through rewards and punishments, that there's something inborn with humans that allow us to acquire languages so fast and without much effort. It seems like it's a lot of effort when we're learning Spanish in high school. But if you were born in a Spanish-speaking household, like you probably never had to, if you're a native English speaker, you didn't have to learn how to speak English. You just spoke English. And that's because that's what we seem to be able to do by birth, that there's a lot of inborn things that only make sense if we have this inborn ability to learn a language, right? Think about learning calculus, right? That's hard to do. Learning English was not nearly as hard. And yet it's so much more complex when you think about it than learning math, right? So why are we able to do one so easily and not another? And again, if you're a child, if you're under the age of say 7, really even up until age 12, right? Up until 7, you can learn any language that you're surrounded by easily just by being around it. That we seem as children, especially attuned to different phonemes, different morphemes, and understanding the languages of those around us. That's why you see a lot of people trying to get bilingual, babysitters or au pairs or things like that if they can afford them, right? Because having access to a whole other language, especially from such an early age, it makes it so much easier for language development later on. Okay. So this is something that I think is really interesting, right? Whenever we think of, when we talk about statistical learning. So one of the complaints that I'll always say and happens a lot is, native Spanish speakers sometimes speak really fast, right? They speak really fast, and it's really hard for us non-native speakers to keep up, right? To be able to follow along. Um, and that almost entirely has to do with our ability to understand the phonemes and the morphemes of a language. That statistically analyzing how words go together, we're able to do that in our native languages very easily. You can imagine here with this example of happy baby, right? So if you're holding a baby and you're going, oh, look at this happy baby, right? How does the baby know over time, or how do we know that it's happy and baby and not hap, p-bay-b, right? Happy baby. Like, how does that? How do we break those two words down, right? You guys understand? Hopefully, you're understanding this. Um, you know, and yes, you can speak really fast in Spanish, but you can also speak really fast in English. And I'm talking pretty quickly here, but you can all understand everything I'm saying, even though that the words are definitely jumbling together. And if you were not a native English speaker, you'd have a really hard time following me because all the words seem to just run together into one long sentence. But because we are English, most of us, I believe, are native English speakers, or if you are a native English speaker, then this becomes a much easier. You were able to do that no problem without any effort. But if I did the same thing in Spanish, you'd have a lot harder time, again, especially if you're a non-native Spanish speaker. Let's tie this into the way that our language influences our thinking. So we know, just by personal experience, that thinking and language are intricately intertwined, right? That you can't think without language, right? Whenever you're thinking about something, it's always in a language. That leads to a lot of interesting questions and scenarios about people who are raised without language, right? Are they actually thinking? Or are babies, before they develop a language, are they thinking? Right? What about non-human animals? Do they ever think, right? If they don't have a language, if there's not this connection. We do know that once we develop a language, that's how we think. We think within languages. And yes, people whose first language, primary language is a sign language, they tend to think in sign as well. So let's talk about how language influences our thinking. So there was this theory in the 50s called linguistic determinism. And basically that said that the way that our language happens to be structured affects the way of our ability to understand the world. So Hopi Native Americans, in the Hopi language, there was no past tense. You just learned that if something happened previously based off of context clues, but there was no past tense for verbs. Which is actually fairly common. This guy named Worf thought that that meant that Native Americans who spoke Hopi or were in the Hopi tribe could not think easily about the past. That if they had a harder time understanding things that happened in the past versus people with a language of that had a past tense. But there's not a lot of evidence that support this. So one is this example from people from Papua New Guinea who don't have the same color breakdowns, right? In fact, all across the world, color words are very different. There's examples of blue traffic lights in Japan, because in Japan, blue is a shade of green. It's not a separate color. So even people without different color words are still able to perceive them very similarly as people with different color words. Another example that's very similar to the Hopi example is I think it's some Scandinavian languages don't have a future tense, right? That there's no way to on a verb to indicate that it's something that's going to happen in the future. And so there was a study done to see whether or not people who speak that language plan for retirement as effectively. I think it was Norwegian, doesn't have a future, but I'm not positive. Do they plan for retirement? Do they save money? Because if you can't think easily about the future, then will you be prepared, for it? And it turns out that, people again, assuming it's Norway, have the same amount of, retirement savings as people in the United States, where we do have a future tense. So linguistic determinism is this idea that our language totally determines the way that we think, but it's not that straightforward. There's a lot more nuance there. And the last thing I really want to mention here is gestures, right? So like even as I'm talking, you might see things moving in and out of the screen because I'm talking with my hands, because humans gesture when we communicate. Non-human animals do that too. And it turns out we think that gestures might have been the initial form of communication. So that could also explain why sign language is so easily adaptable for people who are learning languages. That sign tends to be relatively easy because communicating with our hands might have been the first ways that we actually communicated from an evolutionary standpoint. I know we continue to do that because I don't know, it's fun. It adds emphasis. Who knows? It's been a while since I took my comm skills class, and you keep your hands in the box. And I don't know if they still do that or not, but anyway, I don't think you needed to see any of that on the video. All right, so this was a long video here, guys. I'm sorry, there was a lot here. Not really a good place to break it up. So in this video, we talked about language acquisition, language development in non-human animals, and the theories of Skinner and Chomsky in terms of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition and the what we call nativist or innate theory of language acquisition. Please make sure to reach out with questions, and we'll spend the first couple days back from break going over what questions you have from these videos, as well as a couple activities to do, because of course got to have activities. But yeah, so you should expect a test relatively soon after our return. So yeah, make sure you guys are studying and staying on top of this. All right, well, I'll see you guys in class when that happens after break. All right, guys, until then.